Hey folks, before the video starts, I want to say big thank you for the feedback you gave me in the last video. Again, I will be short and say, as every other video, to leave a like and hit the subscribe button. Also, don't forget to comment down below, helping me to give proof to YouTube that all of you who follow this channel so far are real people who watch my videos. Thank you, and I hope you enjoy. I received an email from a dark web contact warning me about the Purge. The first name on their list was mine. I know what you're thinking. How did I end up on the dark web in the first place? Well, I guess you could say I was one of those people who got a little too curious, too comfortable with the unknown. I wasn't some computer genius or an elite hacker. I was just a college sophomore with an affinity for strange, out-of-the-ordinary stories. I followed deep web horror stories, watched YouTube explainers late at night, and chuckled at tales of people finding hitmen or accidentally ordering organs. To me, it was all fiction, until it wasn't. It started like any other night. My roommate Jake was out at his girlfriend's, so I had the place to myself. I sat at my desk with a lukewarm can of energy drink and my laptop's dim glow casting shadows around my cluttered room. I was deep into a rabbit hole, hopping between obscure forums where people shared stories of shadow markets and digital urban legends. That's when it happened. Ping. My inbox chimed with a sound that shouldn't have existed at that hour. It was late, past 2 a.m., and my email was reserved for professors, spam, and the occasional e-receipt. But this was different. There was no subject line, no preview text, just an address I didn't recognize. The sender's handle was cryptic, enigma_N404. Against my better judgment, I clicked. The body of the email was simple, almost too simple. It starts tonight. Run if you want, but they already know where you are. The Purge is real. First on the list, you. I sat there, the words pulsing on my screen. A chill crawled up my spine, making the tiny hairs on the back of my neck stand to attention. For a moment, I tried to laugh it off. Maybe it was some prank. Maybe Jake had found a way to mess with me. But something in the phrasing, that eerie simplicity, told me otherwise. It didn't feel like a joke. It felt like a countdown. I clicked around, looking for clues in the metadata, anything that might indicate the source. But the email was a ghost, untraceable, and encrypted in ways that went beyond my basic knowledge. My heart thumped so loudly, I almost didn't hear the second ping. This time, the email had a subject, 001 of 015. The list had numbers, names, and addresses. My blood turned to ice as I read, Tyler M., me, Rebecca K., address a few blocks away, Michael L., a senior I recognized from campus. I stopped reading, my breath shallow and quick. The list went on and on, each name linked to a physical address within a 20-mile radius. This wasn't some internet prank. This was precise, targeted. Before I could react, the sound of footsteps echoed from the hallway outside my apartment. Heavy, deliberate. I told myself it was just a neighbor, maybe some drunk dude stumbling back from a party. But as I strained to listen, it was clear. These weren't random movements. They stopped right in front of my door, and the floorboards creaked under the weight of someone who knew exactly where I lived. I fumbled for my phone, but before I could call Jake or the police, a new ping erupted from my laptop. My eyes darted to the screen, now soaked in the pale glow of a second email. The subject, incoming. My breath caught in my throat as I read the message. It's too late now. Do you hear them? The doorknob rattled. The metallic clatter of the doorknob sent a shockwave through my system. I was frozen, my pulse roaring in my ears like a storm. The tiny part of my brain that still clung to logic screamed at me to move, to do something, but my body refused to obey. I stared at the door, half expecting it to burst open, splinters flying, shadows flooding in. But it didn't. The rattling stopped. Silence fell, dense and suffocating, as if the air itself were waiting for something to happen. I dared to exhale, a shaky, broken sound that barely made it past my lips. Ping. My attention snapped back to the laptop, my eyes catching the new message that had just appeared. This one was different, marked with a blood-red icon that stood out starkly against the white background. The subject line simply read, "Look outside." A lump formed in my throat as my gaze shifted to the window. The blinds were half closed, the room lit only by the laptop's glow and a sickly yellow street lamp outside. I stood up, legs trembling, and slowly made my way to the window, each step like a drum beat. I pulled the blinds up an inch and peered out. The street was quiet, cars parked in neat rows, sidewalks empty. But then, just as I began to think this was all some elaborate hoax, I saw them. 3 figures standing at the far end of the block, barely visible in the haze of the lamplight. They wore dark hoodies, faces obscured. One of them raised a hand, almost in greeting or a mockery of it. I dropped the blinds and stumbled back, my heart thrashing in my chest. I fumbled for my phone, dialing Jake's number with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. It rang once, twice. No answer. I tried again. Still nothing. The third time, the call failed to connect, and a sudden realization hit me. My Wi-Fi icon was blinking, struggling to stay connected. A slow crawl of dread crept over me. Whoever sent that email was more than just watching. They were in my network. Before I could even think about turning off the router or doing something remotely rational, my phone buzzed in my hand. An unknown number. My instinct screamed at me not to pick up, but my curiosity, always my downfall, won out. I answered, pressing the phone to my ear. "Hello?" I whispered, my voice barely there. Static crackled, and then a voice followed, deep and distorted, as if layered with digital interference. "Tyler," it said, drawing out my name with a cold, inhuman familiarity. I didn't respond. "We see you." The line went dead. A new sound filled the room, so subtle at first that it could have been mistaken for the wind. A soft scratching at the front door. Not the aggressive rattling from before, but something more insidious. It was deliberate, like nails dragging across the wood, testing, waiting. My mind raced through every horror movie, every urban legend I'd ever heard. None of them prepared me for the fact that this was real, happening right outside my door. With a surge of adrenaline, I grabbed the heaviest thing within reach, a metal desk lamp, and held it like a makeshift weapon. I approached the door on tiptoe, straining to hear beyond the scratching. I positioned my eye at the peephole, heart thundering, and peered out. What I saw nearly made me drop the lamp. An eye stared back at me, wide, bloodshot, the pupil almost unnaturally dilated. It blinked, a slow, mechanical gesture that sent shivers skittering down my spine. The scratching stopped, replaced by a soft, rhythmic tapping, like a heartbeat. I stumbled backward, knocking over a pile of books. The noise echoed in the silence, and the tapping on the door ceased abruptly. Seconds ticked by, each one stretching longer than the last. My breath came in gasps, the air around me growing thick and stifling. Ping, another email, this one marked with the same red icon. It read, "You're next. You should have run." I couldn't take my eyes off the screen, the glow painting my face in pale, ghostly light. The next sound made my heart stop entirely. It wasn't the door. It wasn't the window. It was the sound of my bedroom closet creaking open behind me. The creak of the closet door cut through the silence like a knife. For a moment, the world seemed to freeze. I stood there, barely breathing, every muscle in my body coiled so tight it felt like I might shatter. I glanced at the closet door out of the corner of my eye, the narrow gap between it and the frame now wider, shadows deepening the darkness within. A cold draft whispered out, brushing my face, carrying the faint scent of old wood and something else, something sour and metallic. My eyes flickered between the door and the laptop, still glowing with that ominous email. The words, "You should have run," repeated in my mind like a taunt. I knew I couldn't stand there forever. If something or someone was inside, I needed to know. Gripping the lamp tighter, I took a tentative step forward. The floor creaked under my weight, a groan of protest in the suffocating stillness. I paused, heart pounding so violently it felt as though my ribcage might crack. The closet stood there, gaping open like a silent, mocking mouth. I reached out, my arm trembling, fingers stretching toward the handle. As soon as my skin made contact, a sound erupted from behind me. Knocking. 3 rapid, sharp raps on the window, the kind that would normally be casual if they hadn't been at this hour. I spun around, nearly dropping the lamp. My eyes locked onto the glass. A face stared back at me, expressionless, unblinking. It was pale, almost sickly, with eyes that seemed far too wide for the thin, angular face. It was a mask. Not the type you'd see at Halloween or a masquerade, but something crafted from what looked like old porcelain, cracked around the edges. It moved slightly, tilting its head as if studying me, assessing. My breath came in jagged, shallow bursts as my mind raced. There was no way they could get through the window. I lived on the 3rd floor, but the logical part of my brain was slipping, clawing for answers as fear seized control. The figure raised its hand and tapped the glass again, deliberately slow this time. Tap, tap, tap. I took an involuntary step back, and then another, until my calves hit the edge of the bed. The mask shifted, and I could almost feel its eyes tracking my every move. Suddenly, a new sound crackled to life. My phone, still clutched in my other hand, buzzed with a vibration so sharp I nearly dropped it. A new text notification lit up the screen. "Get out!" Now, I didn't recognize the number, but there was no time to think. The figure at the window pressed its hand against the glass, and for the first time, I noticed the crimson streaks smeared across its fingers. Blood. I snapped out of my paralysis and bolted for the hallway, the lamp slipping from my grip and clattering to the floor as I ran, my heart hammered against my chest, like it was trying to escape before I could. I didn't look back at the window, or the closet, or the shadows that seemed to stretch out and grasp at my ankles as I fled. I just ran. The hallway was dark, but I knew my apartment well enough to navigate by muscle memory alone. I reached the front door, my hand scrambling at the locks with a frenzy I couldn't control. The deadbolt resisted at first, like it was fused to the frame, before finally sliding free with a reluctant metallic clunk. I yanked the door open and stumbled into the corridor, nearly tripping over my own feet. The fluorescent lights above me flickered, buzzing faintly, as they cast a sickly, inconsistent glow. The hallway stretched out in both directions, empty, silent, except for the echo of my panicked breath. Behind me, from within my apartment, a sound rose. Slow, deliberate footsteps, crossing the living room, moving toward the open door. I backed away, eyes locked on the dark space beyond the threshold, the silence broken only by the sound of shoes scuffing against hardwood. Then, a whisper, low and almost amused. "Run, Tyler." I didn't need to be told twice. I turned and bolted down the hallway, the sound of that voice chasing me, slithering down my spine like ice. I reached the stairwell and took the steps, 2, 3 at a time, the sharp corners of the concrete rail digging into my palms as I tried to steady myself. The buzzing lights flickered again, dimming as if to lend the shadows an advantage. The last thing I heard as I pushed through the stairwell door and into the frigid night was a soft, rhythmic tapping echoing down the hall, like a promise whispered just for me. The night air was sharp and biting, hitting me like a slap across the face as I stumbled into the parking lot behind my building. Everything felt too bright and too dark at the same time. Street lamps casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to shift and stretch as I moved. I could barely hear my own footsteps over the pounding of blood in my ears. My breath formed ragged clouds in the cold, dispersing into the air as if trying to escape with me. I looked around, searching for any sign of life, of safety. But the lot was empty, a still canvas of cracked asphalt and silent parked cars. Each car felt like a potential hiding place, a screen for the eyes I knew were watching. My phone buzzed again, and I jumped so violently I nearly dropped it. Another text. Same unknown number. "Get to the corner. Don't stop." I didn't have time to question it. I took off, legs pumping, as I sprinted towards the far end of the lot, past the lines of shadowed vehicles. Each step echoed like a gunshot in the silence, and with every few strides, I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder. The window of my apartment, 3 stories up, stood dark and still, but I knew better than to trust it. The memory of that pale, cracked mask pressed against the glass burned in my mind. I reached the street corner, lungs heaving, the cold searing my throat. The neighborhood was empty, eerily so. It was late, but there should have been a car or two driving past, a flicker of movement in one of the nearby windows. Instead, there was nothing. The only noise was the faint hum of a street lamp overhead, its glow casting a circle of weak yellow light that felt more like a trap than a sanctuary. Another text. "Stay in the light. It's safer there." The words were chilling, almost like an order from someone who knew more about this nightmare than I ever could. I shuffled into the middle of the light, my eyes darting to every shadowy space beyond its reach. The alleyways yawned open, pitch black and hungry. The gaps between parked cars seemed to shift when I looked at them directly, as if something could slither out at any moment. A noise, subtle at first, drifted down the street, a rhythmic, hollow clatter, like wooden beads rapping together, echoing softly. I turned my head slowly, every muscle tight with anticipation. The noise grew louder, steady, accompanied by a sound that made my skin crawl, the faint drag of fabric against pavement. It was coming closer. My phone buzzed again, but this time I didn't check it. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the darkness down the road. A silhouette appeared under the halo of another street lamp, about 30 yards away. It was tall, shrouded in a black coat that flared around its ankles. In its hand dangled a set of long, thin sticks, bound with string. which clacked together as they swayed. A shiver shot down my spine as the figure stopped, just at the edge of the light, face obscured by the hood pulled low. The clacking sticks fell silent. It stood there, unmoving, but I felt its eyes on me, felt the weight of them, sharp and cold, like needles pressing into my skin. I opened my phone with shaking hands, eyes flicking between the screen and the figure. The last message, the one I hadn't read, blazed on my screen. "Don't let them into the light." My heart skipped a beat as the figure took a step forward, its foot just barely grazing the glow of its street lamp. The moment it touched the light, the air seemed to warp, bending inward with a sickening hiss. The ground beneath the figure's feet cracked, a spiderweb of blackened lines spreading outward like an infection. My instincts roared at me to move, to do anything but stand there paralyzed. I took a shaky step back, and the figure paused. The sticks in its hand resumed their clacking, a slow, deliberate beat that seemed to sync with my racing heart. A sound to my left made me jump, a rustling, like someone shifting their weight. My eyes darted to an alley where another figure emerged, this one smaller and wearing a mask that shimmered in the weak light. It was painted with a grin, cracked and crooked, and it tilted its head as it noticed me noticing it. Panic surged through me, burning through my paralysis. I bolted, breaking away from the circle of light and sprinting down the street. The clattering of the sticks grew louder behind me, joined by the slap of footsteps, quick and eager. The corners of buildings blurred as I flew past them, my vision tunneling with sheer terror. The only thought pulsing through my mind was don't look back. The night seemed endless, a maze of empty streets and shuttered buildings. But then, a flicker of hope. A gas station, its fluorescent lights buzzing weakly, standing like a beacon against the dark. I pushed harder, my legs screaming in protest, and slammed into the glass door, nearly crumpling as I burst inside. The attendant, a man in his late 40s, with tired eyes, looked up from his magazine with a start. I tried to speak, to warn him, but no words came. I could only stand there, panting, eyes wild, as I turned and stared at the dark road I had just come from. Nothing. No figures, no masked faces, just the empty night and the faint tapping of my heart echoing in the silence. The gas station lights hummed around me, a cold, unnatural glow that did nothing to soothe my nerves. I stood there, trembling, my eyes glued to the street outside. The night remained quiet, deceptively so, but the echoes of the clacking sticks and footsteps still reverberated in my mind. The attendant's voice finally broke through my trance, gruff and wary. "Hey man, you alright? You look like you've seen a ghost." I wanted to laugh, to scream, to tell him that I'd seen something far worse than any ghost, but all I managed was a ragged, "Did anyone else come in here? Anyone at all?" He raised an eyebrow, glancing at the empty parking lot. "No one's out there but you, kid. What's going on?" I opened my mouth to answer, but before I could, the lights above flickered, buzzing louder, almost angry. The shadows in the corners of the station seemed to stretch and twist, as if reaching out. The man glanced up, muttering a curse as he tapped the flickering light. The moment his fingers brushed the plastic cover, the buzzing stopped, plunging us into an uneasy silence. The front door jangled as it opened. A gust of cold air swept in, and with it, the figure from the street stepped inside. The clacking sticks in its hand were silent now, but they swayed gently as it moved. The hood still obscured its face, but I could see it tilt ever so slightly, acknowledging me. The attendant's eyes narrowed. "Hey, you can't just..." He didn't get to finish. The figure shifted so fast it was a blur, and in the next instant, the man's expression froze. His eyes were wide, mouth parted as if caught mid-sentence, but no sound came out. He stood there, unmoving, fingers still on the flickering light cover. A chill swept over me as I realized he wasn't breathing. "Tyler," the voice whispered from beneath the hood, a raspy, layered sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. My legs locked, useless and trembling. The figure took another step forward, the worn floor tiles cracking beneath its boots as if rejecting its presence. I backed away, the sharp edge of a shelf digging into my spine, his display of snacks and magazines clattering to the floor. My foot hit something solid, and I stumbled, glancing down to see the fallen desk lamp from my apartment. How it got here, I didn't know, but the sight of it filled me with a sickening familiarity. A soft creak came from outside, drawing my attention to the window. A second figure stood there now, the mask from before pressed against the glass, its cracked grin twisted in a sick mockery of amusement. It raised its hand and tapped, once, twice, 3 times. The hooded figure paused at the sound, turning its head slightly, as if acknowledging its companion. That moment was all I needed. I pushed off the shelf and bolted deeper into the store, weaving between aisles and knocking over anything that might slow them down. The fluorescent lights flickered above, casting everything in a strobe of yellow and black, turning the gas station into a disorienting, shifting maze. I reached the back, where the staff-only door gaped open into a dim storage room. I slipped inside, closing the door just enough to leave a crack, my eyes fixed on the front of the store. The hooded figure stood still, facing where I'd been, as if confused. But the moment I exhaled, its head snapped in my direction. The handle of the staff door began to turn, slow, deliberate. I backed up, my foot catching on a metal dolly, sending it skittering with a deafening clatter. My heart dropped. The figure pushed the door open, stepping into the room. I could see it now, up close, the dark fabric of its hood fraying at the edges, shadows shifting beneath it, as though hiding something unspeakable. I grabbed the nearest thing, an old fire extinguisher, and swung it as hard as I could. The canister hit with a metallic thud, knocking the figure back just enough for me to squeeze past and bolt out of the room. I tore through the aisles, breath ragged, the taste of fear metallic on my tongue. But then I heard it, the low rhythmic clacking, now accompanied by the soft shuffling of multiple footsteps. They were closing in. I reached the front of the store, my eyes catching on the emergency exit. My only way out. I pushed through it, the door's alarm shrieking as I burst into the night. The sound jolted the silence, but there was no time to hope for rescue. I sprinted across the parking lot, legs burning, every instinct urging me not to look back. But I did, and what I saw rooted me to the spot. 3 figures stood beneath the gas station's lights, their masks cracked and grinning. The hooded one stood in the center, holding the sticks in one hand, the blood-red lines now visible on them like a tally. They didn't chase me. They didn't need to. They just watched, their stillness more terrifying than any sprint or scream. Then the hooded figure raised a hand and waved. It was a gesture not of farewell, but of certainty, as if saying, "We'll meet again." And as the alarm's echo died into the silent night, I knew it was a promise. found a dark web forum tracking influencers who disappear. My favorite just went missing. I wish I could tell you I'm the kind of person who thrives on adrenaline, seeking out danger like a moth drawn to a flame, but I'm not. I'm just an ordinary 22-year-old college student with a chronic case of curiosity and way too much time on my hands. The thing is, boredom does strange things to people. It makes you take risks, click on those sketchy links, and convince yourself that you can handle whatever comes next. It all started last month when I was home for the summer. Most of my friends had taken off for vacations or internships, leaving me with little to do except work the occasional shift at the local coffee shop and binge watch YouTube. That's where my favorite influencer, Alyssa Joy, came into play. She wasn't your typical lifestyle vlogger. She mixed true crime, unsolved mysteries, and urban exploration into her content. Watching her videos felt like listening to an older sister tell you ghost stories with a flashlight under her chin. Her channel, Joy in the Shadows, was a perfect blend of eerie, entertaining, and just real enough to send shivers down your spine. Then one day, she stopped posting. Just like that. Her last video was a cliffhanger about an abandoned theme park that supposedly had a gruesome history. She promised to follow up, but the upload never came. Days turned into weeks, and her social media accounts went silent. Fans started speculating. A surprise vacation, health issues, even legal trouble. But something in me, that gnawing feeling in the pit of my stomach, whispered that this was different. I was restless that night, scrolling through her old content, refreshing her Twitter like some kind of ritual. That's when I remembered something I'd heard about on one of those late-night, whispered conversations with my friends. The deep web, not the illegal drugs and weapons kind, but the parts that hold secrets, not meant for mainstream eyes. It was probably just paranoia, but I wanted answers. I had no idea that curiosity would lead me into the darkest corners of the internet and into a nightmare I wouldn't wake from. The first few hours were a comedy of errors. I had to watch 3 separate videos on how to download Tor safely, then spend another hour setting up a VPN, feeling like a wannabe hacker in my dimly lit room. When I finally breached the murky waters of the deep web, I didn't know what I was looking for exactly. Just something. It started innocently enough. Forums with weird theories, cryptic chat rooms where people traded coded messages, your typical internet weirdos. But as the clock ticked past midnight, I stumbled onto a site with a bland, nondescript title, Watchers Index. It looked more like an old-school blog than the chilling database it was. The tagline below the header read, Tracking the Shadows of the Vanished. My heart skipped a beat when I clicked on the most recent post. A list of names. Scrolling down, I felt a chill pass over me. The names were all too familiar. Influencers, online personalities, YouTubers, even up-and-coming TikTok stars. People who had one thing in common. They disappeared without warning. And at the very bottom of that list, still bold and newly added, was Alyssa Joy. Suddenly, it didn't feel like a game anymore. A sick realization settled over me. This wasn't just some fan-made forum keeping track of influencers' breaks or rebrandings. The posts here dated back years, and the more I read, the deeper my horror grew. Each name was marked with symbols that, at first, made no sense. There were annotations, like journal entries, detailing strange coincidences, car accidents with no bodies found, sudden vacations that lasted forever, online messages that looked like automated replies but didn't match the person's voice. The rabbit hole was deeper than I could have ever imagined, and I'd just taken the first tumble in. The glow of my laptop screen was the only source of light in the room, throwing long, jittery shadows on my walls. Each click seemed louder than it should, echoing in the stillness of 2 a.m. I clicked on Alyssa's name, fingers trembling, convinced I was about to read something that would change the way I saw her forever. And I was right. When I clicked on Alyssa Joy's name, a new page opened, loading with a slowness that made my skin crawl. The background was a deep, suffocating black, with tiny flickering text that seemed to shimmer like an old TV losing signal. At the top of the page, an image appeared, a grainy black and white snapshot of Alyssa in her usual bright-eyed smile, but her eyes seemed different. There was something off about the expression, almost like it had been edited to seem duller. Dead. Underneath the image, a series of messages scrolled, each time-stamped like a chat log, but all written by the same user, the Chur Watcher 24. Each entry began with the same phrase, sending a chill straight down my spine. Status update. Subject 132. My heart drummed in my ears as I read the first few entries. Status update. Subject 132 shows heightened activity near the abandoned location. High engagement with followers. Timestamp marked. Subject 132 received direct message. Response noted. Timestamp marked. The entries continued, detailing Alyssa's last known movements like an invasive diary that had been kept without her consent. They mentioned her visiting the abandoned theme park the night she filmed what was meant to be her final video. I felt a sharp pang of dread as I read a note about her phone pinging a location that wasn't on any map, marked only as the unmarked lot. I tried to convince myself it was just an elaborate ARG, one of those deep web mysteries that fans put together for kicks. But everything about this site was different. It wasn't playful or quirky. It was cold, clinical, like an autopsy report that hadn't been finished. The latest entry, dated the day she vanished, read, Subject 132, observed, approach initiated, countdown commenced. The words echoed in my head, creating a static hum that was almost deafening. Countdown? To what? Before I could overthink it, I reached for my phone to check Alyssa's social media one more time. Maybe there had been some update or sign of life that I'd missed. But as soon as I clicked on her Instagram, a strange notification popped up at the top of my screen. You've been tagged in a post. My breath hitched. That didn't make sense. I hadn't posted anything in days. But there it was, my handle at Inky Observer, tagged in a post by an account I didn't recognize, at Echoes Behind Shadows. The profile picture was an eye, disturbingly lifelike, with a slit pupil that reminded me of a cat's gaze caught in headlights. My fingers trembled as I clicked on the post. It was a dark image, poorly lit, but I could make out a room full of outdated tech, flickering monitors, a tangle of wires snaking along the floor, and a single chair in the center, turned slightly to face the camera. On one of the monitors, I could just make out a paused video frame of Alyssa's face, wide-eyed and mid-sentence, mouth frozen as if she'd been cut off. The caption read, Subject 132 will no longer upload. I dropped my phone, backing away from my desk like it had caught fire. My brain scrambled for an explanation. Maybe someone hacked my account, or it was just an elaborate hoax. But deep down, I knew there was more to it. A sudden noise jolted me out of my spiraling panic. A muted ding from my laptop. A chat window had popped up, bright and demanding against the black background. The Watcher 24. You shouldn't be here. The message sat there, mocking me. I stared at it, the little blinking cursor daring me to respond. My palms were clammy, and my chest felt tight, but before I could close the tab or power down my computer, another message appeared. They issue Watcher 24. They see you now. I slammed my laptop shut so hard the sound echoed through my empty house. My breathing came in short, sharp bursts as I waited, straining to hear anything out of place. A knock on the door, a rustle outside, footsteps in the hall. But there was nothing, just the steady hum of my mini fridge and the far-off chirp of crickets. It felt like I was suspended in time, waiting for something to snap, for some unseen thread to break. Then, just when I was beginning to convince myself it was all in my head, my phone buzzed with a notification. A direct message from the same account. Add echoes back with shadows. They're closer than you think. A shadow shifted outside my window. My heart slammed against my ribs so hard I thought it might break through. The shadow outside the window was too deliberate to be a trick of the light. I stood frozen, ears straining for any sound. Breathing, footsteps, anything to confirm I wasn't imagining things. But the silence pressed down on me like a heavy blanket, suffocating and still. Slowly, I backed away from the window, each step a test against the creaky wooden floorboards that threatened to betray me. The glow of my laptop seeped from its closed lid, a thin line of light that seemed to pulse like a heartbeat. The room was both too dark and too bright, each shadow suddenly an enemy, each object a potential weapon. I swallowed, trying to steady my breathing. My phone buzzed again, vibrating with an intensity that made me jump. I glanced at the screen, already dreading what I'd see. Another message from at echoes behind shadows. You have 5 minutes. A jolt of adrenaline surged through me, turning my fear into action. I lunged for the curtains and yanked them shut, the sudden movement causing my old wooden blinds to rattle noisily. Too loud. Way too loud. If someone was out there, they'd heard it. My mind raced with fragmented plans. Call the police. Call a friend. Just run. But before I could make a decision, a new sound broke the silence. A low, deliberate tap, tap, tap at the front door. I nearly dropped my phone, my fingers slick with sweat. The tapping didn't repeat. It came once, a signal rather than a request. I stumbled backward, the walls of my room seeming to close in on me. My eyes darted to the hallway that led to the front entrance, and the shadows there seemed to twist and writhe as if they were alive. This wasn't happening. It couldn't be happening. It was some elaborate prank, some sick joke to scare the curious idiot who stuck his nose where it didn't belong. But deep down, I knew this was real. Every instinct screamed that whatever stood outside my door wasn't human, or at least not in the way I understood. I locked my eyes on my phone, scrolling through my contacts with shaking fingers until I found my best friend, Eli. He was the only one who knew about my obsession with the deep web and Alyssa's disappearance. I hit call, willing him to pick up. The ringing tone sounded unbearably loud, each beat a countdown that matched the thundering pulse in my ears. Pick up, pick up, pick up, I whispered, eyes flicking back to the front door. A shuffle sounded outside, like someone brushing against the wooden frame. My skin crawled. The ringing stopped, replaced by a sleepy voice. Yo, it's 3 a.m., dude. What? Eli, I interrupted, voice shaking. "Someone's outside. I don't know what to do. It's..." The call cut out, replaced by static. The screen glitched, flickering as if infected by some unseen virus. I pulled the phone away from my ear, staring as the display blinked and flashed erratically before a new message popped up, centered in black text. "It's too late." My vision swam with panic. I ran to the kitchen, grabbing the biggest knife I could find from the drawer, the cool metal pressing into my palm with a reassuring weight. The silence outside was deafening, but the air was charged, like the moment before lightning strikes. I approached the front door, muscles tensed, every nerve screaming to run, but unable to leave the spot where I stood. The tapping came again. This time, it was louder, as if whatever was on the other side was growing impatient. With my free hand, I reached for the knob, hesitating for the briefest moment before flipping the lock. The sound echoed through the house, sharp and final. I held my breath and yanked the door open. The porch light flickered weakly, casting just enough illumination to reveal nothing. No shadow, no figure lurking in the dark, just the emptiness of my front yard, stretching out to the street, where the glow of a street lamp quivered in the distance. I exhaled shakily, lowering the knife. My fingers were sore from gripping it so hard. A sudden noise behind me made my blood turn to ice. A soft creak, like a footstep on old wood. I spun around, the knife raised defensively, but the hallway was empty. My eyes adjusted to the dim light, taking in the shadows that curled around the edges of the room. The silence stretched, fragile and suffocating, until my gaze landed on my laptop. The screen was no longer dark. It had been flipped open, glowing with a new message, one that hadn't been there before. The words were bright white, stark against the black background. "Come outside. It's your turn now." Something cold brushed against my arm. The touch against my arm was so light, so fleeting, that at first I thought I'd imagined it. But the chill it left behind was unmistakable, seeping into my skin and settling deep in my bones. I spun around, knife clutched so tightly in my hand that my knuckles cracked. The room was empty. At least it looked empty. My eyes darted across the shadows, which seemed thicker now, as though they were watching me. My laptop screen glowed defiantly in the dark, casting a cold light that barely reached the corners of the room. The message on the screen felt like a challenge, a sick joke that was now very real. "Come outside. It's your turn now." The air felt heavy, suffused with something I couldn't name, but could feel, pressing against my chest. My instinct was to get out, to run into the street and scream, until someone, anyone, would hear me. But that same primal voice whispered that going outside, meeting whatever was waiting for me, would be worse than staying put. I gripped the knife and crept down the hallway, eyes darting to the window by the front door. I didn't want to open it again, not after what I'd just experienced, but I needed to see. I shifted one slat of the blinds, just enough to peek through, breath shallow as I squinted into the dark. There was movement, a figure, half shrouded by the flickering light of the street lamp. It stood just on the edge of my yard, facing my house. I couldn't make out a face, just the silhouette of someone tall, unnaturally still. The figure didn't move, didn't breathe. It was as though it were waiting for me to acknowledge it, to step out and face whatever horror it had brought with it. Suddenly, my phone buzzed, breaking the silence with a jolt that almost made me scream. I tore my gaze away from the window and glanced down. Another message from @echoes behind shadows. "Come outside, or we'll come in." My heart was pounding so loudly, I was sure it would wake the whole neighborhood. The figure outside hadn't moved, but something had changed. I felt it like a shift in pressure, a deep hum resonating through the air. This time, there was no mistaking the soft scrape of footsteps on my porch, the slight creak of wood that shouldn't have moved on its own. My stomach dropped as I heard the doorknob rattle, just once. Then a second time, harder, with the force of someone testing how much resistance they'd face if they forced their way in. I backed up slowly, each step feeling like it took an eternity. My eyes were locked on the door, waiting for it to burst open, for whatever stood outside to come spilling in with it. The rattle stopped, replaced by silence so intense it roared in my ears. I took one last, desperate glance at my laptop, still displaying that taunting message. A new line appeared as I watched, the cursor blinking slowly, as if savoring my terror. "We're inside." Before I could even comprehend the message, the temperature in the room plummeted. The shadows in the corners seemed to expand, pooling and shifting, and I realized too late that they weren't just tricks of the light. Something moved within them, an outline barely discernible, black on black, only visible when the glow from my laptop cast a weak, quivering halo. A whisper, soft and impossibly close, brushed past my ear. It spoke with a voice that sounded like static, words broken and reassembled in a way that made my skin crawl. "Turn around." I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Every muscle in my body locked up, as if my nerves had been hijacked. But then, the whisper came again, this time louder, a command. "Turn around." Against every screaming part of my mind, I obeyed. Standing in the middle of my living room was a figure. It was wrapped in darkness, a shape that seemed half-formed, shifting as though it couldn't quite hold its own weight. But what froze me was its eyes, or what should have been eyes. They were empty sockets, dark and glistening, absorbing the dim light in a way that made them look like deep, wet holes. Before I could scream, the figure moved. It didn't walk. It glided, soundless and quick, closing the distance between us in the blink of an eye. Cold, slender fingers brushed against my cheek, and that same static voice whispered directly into my mind. "Come with us." A flood of images burst behind my eyes. Alyssa Joy, wide-eyed and trapped in a place with no light. The abandoned theme park, now shifting and alive with something lurking just out of view. The list of names on that damned website, each one crossed out, each one a whisper lost to the dark. I shut my eyes tight and swung the knife blindly, the resistance of empty air mocking me. When I opened them again, the figure was gone. The room was silent. My laptop, the only light, now showed a blank screen. Then, from somewhere deep within my house, I heard a door open. The sound of the door opening echoed through the house, splitting the silence like a blade. My body reacted before my mind could catch up, and I backed up against the wall, knife clutched uselessly in my shaking hand. The hallway loomed like a dark mouth, stretching deeper into the house, where the open door waited, unseen but felt. Every instinct screamed to get out, to run, but the weight of the darkness pinned me in place. My breathing was ragged, each inhale catching in my throat like it didn't want to be there. A metallic taste filled my mouth, as if my body knew fear so raw that even my blood had turned sour. Then a sound came from the open doorway at the end of the hall, a low, steady hum, like electricity coursing through a line too taut to hold it. It vibrated through the walls, through my bones, until I could feel it in the pit of my chest. And then there was something else. A voice. No, not a voice. Many, overlapping and distorted, calling out in unison from the dark. Come and see. The knife slipped from my fingers, clattering to the floor, but the noise didn't break the spell. My legs moved on their own, shuffling one hesitant step at a time toward the hallway. I wanted to stop, to scream, to do anything other than move forward, but the pull was too strong. It felt as though invisible hands were guiding me, pushing me gently but firmly toward whatever waited beyond that open door. The hum grew louder, building into a static buzz that swallowed the whispering voices. I reached the end of the hallway and stood in front of the doorway, heart pounding so hard it felt like it would tear through my ribs. The door led to the basement, a place I hadn't set foot in for months. I peered into the blackness below, the staircase yawning down like the jaws of a beast. The air here was colder, dense with something ancient, something wrong. I strained my ears and realized that beneath the hum and static, there was another sound, whimpering. It was faint, almost drowned out, but it was there. A voice I recognized, twisted with fear. Alyssa, I whispered, the name barely more than a breath. As if in response, a light flickered at the bottom of the stairs. A sickly, greenish glow, like an old emergency light, running on its last gasp of power. The illumination did nothing to comfort me. It only deepened the shadows, casting strange, shifting shapes that danced across the walls. I took a step down, and then another, each creak of the wooden stairs, feeling like a countdown. The hum grew deafening as I reached the bottom, and the light pulsed as though in sync with a heartbeat that wasn't mine. The basement was almost empty, save for a single object in the center of the floor, an ancient tube television, the kind you'd find collecting dust at a thrift store. Its screen was cracked, but it glowed, filled with writhing static and distorted images that fought to form. The static shifted, flickered, and then the screen filled with Alyssa's face. But it wasn't the vibrant, fearless expression I knew. Her eyes were wide, mouth agape, as if she were mid-scream, frozen in a loop of silent terror. The screen crackled, and a voice, garbled and wet, like it was seeping from the TV itself, spoke. You found us. Now, you join us. I stumbled back as the screen went black, plunging the room into darkness. A sound behind me made me whirl around, a soft, rhythmic tapping. My breath caught in my chest as I made out a shape in the corner, tall and shrouded in shifting shadows. 2 empty sockets glistened where eyes should have been, and the air turned frigid as it stepped forward, reaching out a hand that seemed to flicker in and out of existence. The whispers started again, circling me like a current, each voice blending into the next until they were a storm. My vision blurred as cold fingers brushed my arm and the basement fell away, the darkness wrapping around me like a suffocating shroud. For a moment, I thought I could hear Alyssa's voice, faint and far away, echoing in the static. Run! But there was nowhere left to run. I was sent a package from the dark web with a note saying, "Keep it safe. I don't know what's inside, and I'm afraid to open it. So I guess I should start with a little backstory here. You know, so it makes sense why I even bothered getting close to this thing in the first place. I'm not some edgy tech guy or a hacker obsessed with the deep web. Nope. I'm just your average 25-year-old dude with too much curiosity and way too much time on his hands. Blame quarantine for that. YouTube rabbit holes turned into Reddit threads, which turned into late-night Discord chats, where people would share their deep web adventures. Most of it was exaggerated junk, haunted files, pixelated videos of creepy dolls, urban legends we'd laugh about until we all logged off and went to bed. But then, last week, something happened that pulled me out of lurker mode and dumped me right into the heart of my worst nightmare. It was Tuesday morning, around 10 a.m. I was still half asleep, clutching my second cup of coffee like it was life support, when I heard a knock at the door. Not my usual Amazon delivery. The guy always left stuff on the porch and booked it. This knock was sharp, impatient, like whoever was on the other side wanted to make sure I answered. I stumbled to the door, fighting off that early morning grogginess, and pulled it open. No one was there. Just a cardboard box sitting on my welcome mat. It wasn't marked with any of the usual logos or stickers. It was plain, with dark brown tape running haphazardly across the seams, like whoever packed it was in a rush or had shaky hands. I looked up and down the street. Nothing. Not even the usual nosy neighbor who loved to shout hellos at me over the fence. Just empty, quiet suburbia. The box wasn't heavy when I picked it up, but it had a weird weight distribution, like there was something solid shifting inside. Taped to the top was a plain white note. No fancy handwriting, just block letters scrawled out with a black marker. Keep it safe. I'm not going to lie to you. I laughed. Yeah, right. My mind jumped straight to pranks from friends. Those send your buddy a mystery box gags you see on Instagram. I took it inside and put it on my coffee table, where it just sat there, staring at me while I finished my now cold coffee. I told myself I'd open it after lunch, let the mystery simmer for a bit. Honestly, I was hoping it'd just be something goofy. But that afternoon, when I finally decided to rip the tape and see what was inside, something weird happened. My phone buzzed with a notification. A single text from an unknown number. Don't open it yet. Are you alone? The room suddenly felt a whole lot smaller. My heart thumped once, twice, like a drumbeat in a horror movie. I looked at the box, half expecting it to move, but it sat there, still and silent. Here's the thing. I don't give out my number. Not online, not to apps, nowhere. It's tied to too many things that could cause trouble if leaked. My paranoia kicked in hard. I deleted the text, tossed my phone on the couch, and stood up like somehow being upright would give me control over whatever was happening. I ran a hand over my face, took a deep breath, and did the only thing that felt remotely normal in that moment. I called my friend Eric. He's one of those tech-savvy, ultra-skeptical guys who always knows what to do when things get weird. Hey man, you free? I said, trying to sound casual. Sure, Eric replied, his voice muffled like he had a mouthful of chips. What's up? You sound weird. I hesitated, eyeing the box again. The room seemed darker, the light from the window casting odd shadows across the floor. I got this package, I finally said. Came with a note that just said, keep it safe. And then I got a text. Whoa, wait, Eric cut me off. What do you mean, you got a text? From who? I don't know. It was an unknown number. Just said not to open it, and asked if I was alone. The silence on the other end of the line felt like it stretched out for hours. Okay, he said slowly. First, don't touch that thing. And second, don't respond to any more texts. I'm coming over. I hung up, not realizing I'd been holding my breath until the silence returned to my living room. I sat down, the box still at my feet, and waited. Every second felt like an eternity. Every creak of the house made my skin crawl. When Eric finally showed up, his expression told me he thought this was serious too. "Where is it?" he asked, and I pointed, my throat suddenly dry. He leaned over the box, squinting at the taped edges, and then the note. "We need gloves," he muttered. That's when I knew. This wasn't just a prank. Eric rummaged through his backpack and pulled out a pair of thin, disposable gloves, the kind you'd see in a crime show when they're dusting for prints. He tossed me a pair and slipped his on with a snap. The way he approached the box made my nerves jump to a whole new level. He was careful, almost too careful, like he expected it to explode or something. "Dude, it's just a box," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. The silence that followed made me regret opening my mouth. Eric shot me a look that said, "You really don't get it, do you?" He ran his fingers along the edges of the tape. "Look, packages with vague notes and anonymous texts aren't just some random prank," he said, "especially with your deep dive into weird online corners lately. You might have pinged someone's radar." That made me shiver. The deep web was something I'd browsed out of morbid curiosity, but only from the sidelines. I'd read stories about illegal auctions, cryptic live streams, all that urban legend stuff, but I never thought I'd get a front row seat to any of it. Eric leaned back, still not opening the box. "Before we do this, I need to check something." He whipped out his phone and started tapping away, muttering under his breath. I couldn't catch all of it, but phrases like untraceable and VPN breach popped up. The air was heavy with anticipation, the kind that makes you feel like you're teetering on the edge of a cliff. Finally, he looked up. "All right," he said, exhaling a breath that had been trapped in his chest. "Let's see what we're dealing with." He sliced through the tape with a pocket knife, the shick sound making my heart race faster. The flaps popped up, and a weird, musky smell wafted out. It wasn't rotting or metallic, just old, like something had been locked away for too long. Inside was a small, tightly wrapped bundle in crumpled brown paper. The paper had dark smudges on it, like oil or old ink. On top of it was another note, smaller than the first, written in the same blocky handwriting. "Do not break the seal." Eric's eyes narrowed, and I swear, the room temperature dropped a few degrees. He reached into the box and pulled out the bundle. It was light, maybe the size of a paperback book, but the way he held it made it seem like it weighed a ton. He turned it over, inspecting the edges. That's when I noticed it. The paper wasn't just dirty. It was bound with what looked like waxy, black string, sealed at the knots with red, hardened wax, imprinted with some strange symbol. "Is that a sigil?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Eric's face was pale. He looked at me, and I could see the gears turning in his head, connecting dots I hadn't even known existed. "I think so," he whispered. "This is bad, man. Really bad. Like, prank gone too far bad? Or we should call someone bad?" I asked, even though I was terrified of what the answer might be. Before Eric could respond, my phone buzzed on the couch. Both of us jumped. The screen lit up with a new message from that same unknown number. "You opened it. Now you must watch it." The room was so silent, I could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. I felt a pulse of heat rise to my face. Eric glanced at the message, and then at the sealed bundle in his hands. He set it down gently on the table and backed away, like it might lunge at him. "Put your phone on silent," he said, his voice suddenly commanding, "and don't respond." "But what does it mean, watch it?" I asked, half hoping he'd laugh and tell me it was just someone pulling an elaborate prank, but his expression stayed serious. "It could be anything," A tape, a file, a cursed object, he said. The last two words made me scoff nervously, but his face stayed stern. My phone buzzed again, and against my better judgment, I checked it. "You're running out of time." Eric's eyes met mine, and for the first time, I saw real fear in them. Not the kind of fear that makes you jump during a scary movie. This was different, deeper, primal. "We need to find out who sent this and why," he said. "But first, we're getting out of here. We'll go to my place. It's more secure." I grabbed my keys and stuffed the package back into the box. We bolted out the door, leaving behind the comfort of normalcy I once took for granted. I locked the door, my hand shaking as the key turned. The street outside was just as empty as it was that morning, but now it felt hostile, like the quiet had eyes. And as we walked to the car, I couldn't help but feel like we were being watched. Eric's car was parked a few houses down, a dented blue hatchback that had survived years of college road trips and late-night fast food runs. It felt almost absurd that this old, familiar vehicle was now our lifeline. I slid into the passenger seat, hugging the box like it was something precious and deadly all at once. Eric jumped in, glanced nervously at his mirrors, and started the car. The engine sputtered to life, and I felt a small pang of relief. That feeling didn't last long. As we pulled away from the curb, I couldn't shake the sensation that someone was watching. The quiet street, usually so peaceful, now felt like a stage where unseen eyes followed our every move. My head snapped to the left when I thought I saw a curtain twitch in one of the neighboring houses, but it was too quick, too subtle. The house stood dark and motionless, like everything else around us. "Did you see that?" I asked, my voice strained. Eric didn't respond, his knuckles whitening as he gripped the wheel. The silence in the car was suffocating. We turned onto a busier road, where the sight of other cars and people walking their dogs should have been comforting. It wasn't. Everything felt off, like a movie scene where you know something is about to go terribly wrong. We reached Eric's place, a small brick house on the edge of town. He killed the engine and sat there for a moment, both of us listening to the tick of the cooling motor. The sun had started to dip lower, casting long shadows across the yard. A breeze stirred the branches of the old oak tree out front, making them sway like skeletal fingers. "Let's move," Eric finally said, breaking the silence. We grabbed the box and made our way inside. His living room was cluttered with gaming consoles and stacks of old tech magazines, a reminder of how normal things used to be. Now it felt like a fortress, each window a potential breach point. He double-locked the door and drew the curtains before setting the box down on the coffee table. The sealed bundle inside seemed to radiate a presence, like it knew we were planning something. Eric's cat, a fat tabby named Widget, sauntered into the room, sniffed the air, and hissed. He backed away, eyes wide, fur standing on end, before bolting down the hallway. "That's not a good sign," I muttered. "No kidding," Eric said, his voice barely above a whisper. He dropped his backpack on the floor and pulled out his laptop. "We need to figure out where this came from. I'm going to trace that number." I nodded, more for myself than for him. Anything to feel like we were still in control. As Eric worked, I picked up the sealed bundle again. The black, waxy string was tied in intricate knots, and the red seal in the middle looked older than it should. I traced the symbol on the wax with my finger, a circle with intersecting lines, almost like a compass, but with strange, broken angles. Before I could think twice, my phone buzzed again. I pulled it from my pocket, dread settling in my stomach like a stone. Another message, short and taunting. "It's watching." I swallowed hard and showed the message to Eric. He stopped typing, eyes darting from the phone to the bundle, then to me. "We're not alone," he whispered. He glanced out the window, moving the curtain just a fraction of an inch. I mirrored his action at the opposite window and peered into the darkening street. At first, I saw nothing but the dull glow of streetlights and the occasional car passing by. Then, as my eyes adjusted, I saw a figure. A tall silhouette stood at the end of the driveway, perfectly still, just outside the reach of the light. It was dressed in what looked like a long coat, the collar pulled up so high that it obscured half its face. Even from that distance, I could feel its gaze piercing through me. "Eric," I said, my voice catching in my throat. He didn't need to ask what I meant. He moved to the window beside me and let out a slow, controlled breath. "Don't move. Don't react," he instructed. I froze, my pulse thundering in my ears. The figure stood there for what felt like an eternity, motionless, like it was waiting for something. Suddenly, the streetlight above the driveway flickered, casting strange, dancing shadows across the figure's face. It was only then that I realized its eyes were glinting, not from the light, but from a reflection, like polished glass, or the dark surface of a camera lens. The light went out completely, plunging the driveway into darkness. When it came back on, the figure was gone. Eric locked eyes with me, and I knew we were in deeper than we'd ever been before. "We need help," I whispered. He nodded slowly. "But from who?" Before I could answer, there was a knock at the door. Not the sharp, impatient knock from before, but a slow, deliberate thud. 3 times. Thud, thud, thud. The house held its breath, and so did we. The knocks echoed in the quiet room, each one slower and heavier than the last. I didn't realize I was holding my breath until Eric whispered, "Stay back." He crept toward the door, moving as quietly as a shadow, and peered through the peephole. His face drained of color, a look of sheer disbelief twisting his features. "What?" I mouthed, my voice barely making a sound. He glanced back at me, shaking his head. I stood paralyzed as he turned the deadbolt slowly, as if trying not to wake some sleeping monster. The door creaked open just enough for him to see outside, the chain lock keeping it secure. From my angle, I couldn't see what he saw, but the air seemed to crackle with something unspoken and electric. "Who's there?" Eric asked, his voice stronger than I felt. For a moment, there was nothing, just the steady hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the wall clock. Then a voice, soft and raspy, like leaves scraping across pavement, broke the silence. "Return it, before it's too late." A chill shot down my spine, and I stepped closer, against every instinct screaming at me to run. I caught a glimpse of the figure on the other side, a man, or at least I thought it was a man, wrapped in a threadbare coat. His eyes were barely visible under a wide-brimmed hat, but what I did see were 2 deep-set pits of darkness. He wasn't old, exactly, but there was something ancient about him, like he'd stepped out of a forgotten century. Eric didn't flinch. "What is it?" he demanded. The man shifted, the movement sending a metallic clink through the air, like chains brushing against each other. He held up one gloved hand, palm out, fingers slightly curled. "Return it, or it will come for you," he said. His voice cracked on the last word, breaking into a whisper that was almost drowned out by a sudden gust of wind outside. Before either of us could say anything, the man took a step back, melted into the shadow of the tree, and was gone. Eric shut the door with a force that made the walls shake. He clicked the locks, one after another, and then stepped back, his face pale and tight with fear. "We need to get rid of it," he said, nodding toward the bundle on the coffee table. The room seemed to pulse, as if it were alive and listening. I could feel the walls closing in, and the package in front of us felt heavier than ever, its presence more oppressive. Widget, Eric's cat, peered cautiously from around the corner, his eyes wide and unblinking. "Burn it," I suggested, my voice cracking with the absurdity of it. But Eric didn't laugh or roll his eyes. He nodded, which only made the whole thing more surreal. "Burn it," he agreed. Without waiting for second thoughts, he grabbed the bundle and carried it to the fireplace. The wax seal glistened under the low light, looking almost wet as he set it in the hearth. I threw in some crumpled newspaper and wood, my hands shaking so badly I dropped a log before getting it right. Eric struck a match, the flame hissing to life before catching the edges of the paper. For a moment, nothing happened. The flames licked around the bundle, dancing across the string, and then a sharp, ear-splitting crack split the air. The bundle burst open, not with the slow, melting burn I expected, but violently, as if it resisted the fire. Something dark and oily erupted from inside, splattering against the brick with a smell so foul it made my eyes water. The flames twisted, turning an unnatural, inky black as they flared higher, reaching out like tendrils. Eric fell back, coughing. I stumbled into the coffee table, knocking over a stack of magazines as I watched in horror. From within the burning bundle, a voice, deep and guttural, echoed out, but it wasn't speaking in any language I knew. The sound made my head ache, like static screaming directly into my brain. "Turn it off! Put it out!" I shouted, scrambling to grab the fire extinguisher from the corner. Eric, wide-eyed and panicked, nodded frantically and reached for it, but the second he touched the handle, the flames shuddered and collapsed inward, leaving the room pitch black. The silence was immediate, suffocating. For a split second, it felt like time had stopped. Then the room filled with a low, rattling breath that didn't belong to either of us. My pulse thundered in my ears as I slowly turned my head toward the source. The dark, oily substance from the bundle was seeping out onto the floor, pooling into a shape that shouldn't have been possible. It rose, shifting and writhing, until it formed the rough outline of a figure. Its face, if you could call it that, was a hollow space, and within that space, two glistening, insect-like eyes blinked open. Eric and I backed away, our breaths coming in ragged gasps. The thing turned its head toward us, and though it didn't have a mouth, I could feel it smile. The deep, raspy voice from before echoed in my mind, this time louder and more forceful. "You were warned." The last thing I remember before everything went dark was Eric's hand grabbing mine, and the sound of glass shattering as the windows burst inward. When I came to, the room was cold, far colder than it should have been. My body felt heavy, like I'd been submerged in water. I sat up slowly, wincing at the sharp pain in my head. Broken glass glittered across the floor like shards of ice, and a draft whispered through the gaping hole where the window had once been. The moonlight streamed in, casting a cold, bluish glow over everything. Eric was slumped against the far wall, eyes wide open and unseeing, but he stirred when I called his name. "Eric?" I croaked, my voice raw and trembling. He blinked once, twice, and then reality seemed to crash back down on him. He pushed himself upright, scanning the room with the frantic, unfocused gaze of someone just pulled from a nightmare. The bundle, now a pile of charred, twisted string and oily ash, lay in the center of the fireplace, its burnt remains smoldering faintly. "Is it gone?" I asked, not really wanting to know the answer. Eric stood, his legs shaking, and walked over to the mess. He poked at it with a fire poker, the embers hissing in protest. The dark, viscous substance that had erupted was gone, leaving only an acrid, sour smell in the room. "I don't know," he said, voice low. His eyes flicked to the shattered window, then back to me. "But we're not safe here." The words hadn't fully registered when a new sound cut through the room. A dragging, shuffling noise came from outside, the slow, deliberate scrape of something being pulled across concrete. I felt my stomach drop. Eric motioned for me to stay quiet, and we both crouched, listening as the sound grew louder, moving along the path toward the front door. Thump, thump, scrape. It stopped, and silence wrapped around us again. I dared to peek through the broken window, my heart hammering so loudly I was sure whatever was outside could hear it. What I saw made my blood run cold. In the center of the driveway, illuminated by the moonlight, was the tall figure from earlier, but it wasn't alone. Behind it, dark shapes, shadowy humanoid figures that seemed half-formed, like sketches drawn in ink, crouched and twitched. They surrounded the figure, their movements jerky and unnatural, heads twisting in impossible angles. The figure raised one long arm, and for a moment, the world seemed to freeze. Then it pointed directly at the house, at me, as if it knew exactly where I was. Eric didn't wait. He grabbed my arm and yanked me backward, away from the window. "We need to move. Now." We stumbled toward the back of the house, our footsteps crunching on the broken glass. The air was thick, every breath tasting like smoke and something bitter. Widget darted past us, his tail puffed out, vanishing into the hallway with a yowl. As we made it to the back door, another knock sounded. This one was slow and rhythmic, echoing through the house like a heartbeat. I looked at Eric, and the fear in his eyes mirrored my own. "It's not just one of them," he whispered, barely moving his lips. "They're trying to get in." The knocking turned into pounding, as if 100 fists were battering the front door. I felt the walls vibrate with each thud, the plaster cracking around the frames. The shadows outside began to move, slipping under the front door and spreading across the floor like a dark tide. Their presence filled the room with an icy pressure, making it hard to breathe. "Run!" Eric shouted, shoving me towards the basement door. We stumbled down the narrow steps, feet barely touching the ground as we descended into darkness. The air was damp and cold, the only light coming from a flickering bulb that cast long, shivering shadows on the walls. I pressed myself into a corner, trying to make myself small, trying not to exist. Above us, the pounding grew louder, turning into a cacophony that reverberated through the house. I could hear the sound of wood splintering, the groan of the front door giving way. Then, silence again. A long, drawn-out breath filled the space above us, rattling the floorboards. I squeezed my eyes shut, hoping, praying it would pass. A sudden, guttural voice filled the basement, making the hair on my neck stand on end. "Return what is owed, or face the shadow of your debt." Eric's eyes met mine in the half-light. His mouth formed a single, silent word. "Why?" Before either of us could move, the light above flickered out, plunging us into complete darkness. The sound of skittering feet and whispers swept through the basement, a cold, spectral wind that made the temperature drop even further. The voice spoke again, this time from behind me. Your time is up. A cold, heavy hand clamped down on my shoulder, and the room tilted. My vision swam as the world dissolved into black. When I woke up, it was morning. Weak sunlight filtered through the broken basement window, casting the debris in a soft, almost forgiving glow. The pounding in my head matched the dull ache in my chest. I turned and saw Eric lying a few feet away, breathing but unconscious, his hand still clutching the fire poker. The house was silent. Whatever had come for us was gone, or at least it was hiding. The bundle was nowhere to be found. In its place was a new note, its black letters seared into the floorboards. You can never hide from what you owe. I wish I could say we found answers or peace after that night, but deep down, I knew better. We had kept the bundle safe, just like the note had instructed, but we hadn't understood what it meant or why it was ours to guard, and now we would never truly be free of it.